Hi everyone, and welcome to today's first lesson on topic B3, which is infection and response. Today's first lesson is on types of pathogens and diseases. You will need a pen and some paper to complete today's lesson. So if you do not have one, please pause this video and go and find one now. Today's challenge is to describe how pathogens can be transmitted from one person to another, and our aspire today is to explain how certain diseases are treated and the symptoms they present. So the starter for today's lesson is I would like you to write down on your piece of paper, what do you think a pathogen is? So it's a term that you might have heard before, the word pathogen. So I'd like you to write down what you think it means. And there are 4 types of pathogens that exist, and you would have come across them at some stage before with the science that you've learned in year 7 or year 8. So I would like you to write them down, what you think the answers are. I'm going to give you 2 minutes, off you go. Okay, so the answer to the questions at the starter, a pathogen is a microorganism which causes infectious diseases. There are 4 types of pathogens that you may have heard of before. Some of these will be very common to you, so viruses, bacteria, fungi and protists. Example of viral infections that you've probably heard of, a common one is HIV. Another one that you may have heard of is influenza, which is the flu virus, and then obviously the one that's been in very recent times is the coronavirus. And then a bacterial infection in humans could be Salmonella, it could be tuberculosis, it could be gonorrhea. A fungal infection is something like athlete's foot, and then a disease caused by a protist in humans is malaria. So the first type of pathogen that I would like to talk to you about in detail is the bacteria group of pathogens. Bacteria are unique. They are able to live in your body by themselves and reproduce by themselves because they have all the mechanisms that they need inside their cell to survive. They are very small. They reproduce at a very, very quick rate. And bacteria, some of them produce poisons, which we call toxins, and they are what damage our tissues and make us feel poorly when we're actually invaded with these types of pathogen. Just a little bit about bacteria. They have a cell wall. They do have no nucleus, so their DNA is actually floating within the cytoplasm. And some bacteria have little hair-like projections on the end, like a little tail called a flagellum. And this basically helps the bacteria to move along. It helps it to swim effectively. So I've got a question for you. There's one type of medication that only is able to treat bacterial infections. What I want you to do now, and I'm only going to give you 20 seconds, I'd like you to name that one type of medication that you may know that treats bacterial infections. So 20 seconds, off you go. Okay guys, so hopefully you've got written down the medication that treats bacterial infections is the antibiotic group of medication. This is really important that you actually remember this, that antibiotics are the only drug that works on bacterial infections. It cannot be used to treat viruses, so you cannot take antibiotics if you have something like the flu or like coronavirus, so it will only work on bacterial infections. The next group of pathogens that I'd like to talk to you about is the viruses. Now, viruses are a lot different than bacteria. They have to invade our cells and take over the mechanisms of our cells to be able to survive. So on their own, they can't survive at all. They are very much smaller than a bacteria. And when they reproduce inside our cells, they cause our cells then to get damaged and they burst open, and that's what makes us feel ill. So I'll just give you a little example. When you have a cold is a viral infection, and when you start getting a cold and you feel like you've got a sore throat, what's happened there is the viruses have actually gone into the cells in your throat and they've reproduced and they've burst open the cell. And by bursting open the cell, it's then damaged it and killed the cell. And so that's why your throat feels sore. Now, obviously, because viruses need to go into our cells to be able to take over the mechanisms to be able to reproduce and to live, they are actually not living cells themselves. And they are very fast replicating, just like bacterial infections are. Okay, so diseases that are caused by pathogens are called communicable diseases, and this means that they can be passed from one person to another. There are other types of diseases, though, which you need to know that cannot be caught. Okay, and these are diseases such as inherited diseases, and one that you need to familiarise yourself with and that you'll learn about in B6 is cystic fibrosis. Other diseases as well that are not caught is deficiency diseases, which might be caused by lack of vitamins or minerals in your diet. So examples of this could be like scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C in your diet, or diseases like cancer. Again, it's not a disease that is caught, it is just due to genetic factors that you get something like that. So I've got a question now for you. How can pathogens be transmitted or spread from one person to another? Okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to write down all of your ideas and your answers to this question. So how can pathogens be transmitted or spread from one person to another? So you have 2 minutes, off you go. Okay, so the answer to how can pathogens be transmitted, spread from one person to another, you should have written down on your sheet of paper: by direct contact, so that's just touching people, through dirty water, through droplets that might be in the air from people coughing or people even talking or breathing, unhygienic food preparation, so that might be cutting raw chicken on a chopping board and then preparing salad on the same board, or by a vector, which is an organism which spreads disease. Okay, so the first disease that you need to know for your GCSE science exam is the viral disease of measles. So measles is an extremely infectious disease that is often caught by young people and children. It is spread through the air by tiny little droplets that are caused when an infected person sneezes. Some of the symptoms of measles is a fever, so a high temperature, and a skin rash. And how we actually prevent measles from actually even being a thing is there is a vaccination program, and it's the MMR jab, which stands for measles, mumps and rubella, which is actually used to prevent measles from ever actually being an issue. So my question to you is, how could we prevent measles? So I'm going to give you a minute to write down as many things as possible. So just read again what I've just said of how it is spread. So I want you to reread it and actually think about how we can prevent measles from actually being a problem. So write down all your ideas. You've got a minute. Off you go. Okay, so hopefully on your pieces of paper, from the text above, we know that measles is spread through the air in tiny droplets after an infected person sneezes. So we could prevent measles by coughing or sneezing into a tissue, washing our hands thoroughly, and making sure that children are vaccinated. They are given the MMR jab against measles. Okay, so the next disease that you need to know for your GCSE science exam is the next viral disease, and this is a plant viral disease called the tobacco mosaic virus, and you may see it written or abbreviated as TMV. So the tobacco mosaic virus commonly affects the tobacco plant, tomato plants and pepper plants, and it is transmitted through the leaves of the plants touching each other, or by farmers going from one plant and touching one plant to the next. And basically it affects the chloroplasts in the leaves, and it causes the leaf colour to change from green to yellow. So what it effectively does is it stops the plant from being able to photosynthesize. And also it can make the leaves crinkled, and it can make them curl up on the ends. Unfortunately, there is no cure at all for the tobacco mosaic virus. So the only option that farmers has is basically to stop their crops being infected or reduce the spread they have. Most farmers tend to actually destroy their crops if there is no cure for viruses in plants. So my question to you is, how does the infected chloroplast affect the plant? So I'm going to give you a minute to tell me how you think that the infected chloroplast affects the plant. Off you go. Okay guys, so hopefully you've got written down that by the chloroplast being affected, that obviously the plant can no longer photosynthesize, so it can't produce glucose and therefore make proteins, and so it can't grow properly. And this then can reduce the farmer's crop yields. And then they may get into a situation where they decide that they can't make enough money from this. So it can really be detrimental to farmers who are growing these types of crops if they get tobacco mosaic virus. So the next disease that you need to know for your GCSE science exam is the viral disease HIV. HIV is probably something that you've heard about many times before. It stands for the human immunodeficiency virus, and this infection is transmitted by bodily fluids, often during unprotected sex, but also can be caught through cuts and injecting drugs using shared needles. So initially, people, when they catch HIV, they have very mild flu-like symptoms, and these then pass, so people that actually get infected just think that they've had the flu. And so for a long period of time, some infected people may not actually know that they have the HIV infection. So once the HIV virus becomes active, it will start to attack the patient's immune system. And at the point then HIV becomes AIDS. Now there's no cure at all for HIV and AIDS. You're probably already aware of that. Although scientists are always trying to find one, because there is a lot of people, especially in Africa, that actually have HIV and AIDS. The treatment currently for when people are infected with HIV is they're given antiretroviral drugs, and they actually slow down the development of AIDS. So what I would like you to do for me now is I'm going to give you a minute, and I would like you, knowing how HIV is actually spread, I would like you to write down some ideas of how HIV could be prevented. So how we could stop it from being spread from human to human. So I'm going to give you 1 minute. Off you go. So guys, the question was, how could HIV be prevented? And obviously the first thing that I told you was that it's transmitted by bodily fluids, often during unprotected sex, also through cuts and injecting drugs using shared needles. So a way of preventing HIV would obviously be to avoid unprotected sex, so to use condoms or abstain from having sex with somebody, and also not to share needles. So the next disease that you need to know for your GCSE science exam is the bacterial disease of gonorrhea. So gonorrhea is a very, very common infection. It's a sexually transmitted infection, and it's common amongst young people. Gonorrhea, when you catch gonorrhea, you get a burning pain when you urinate, and you often get a thick yellow or green discharge from an infected person's penis or vagina. And if it is untreated, eventually it can result in infertility. Because gonorrhea is a bacterial disease, it can be treated by antibiotics, although we have to be very careful about using antibiotics, because if they're overused or misused, scientists believe that one day antibiotics may not work properly. So there is a question for you on the right hand side of the page. Knowing how gonorrhea is spread, I would like you to write down some ideas on how we could prevent the spread of gonorrhea. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to write down your ideas. Off you go. So, how could we prevent the spread of gonorrhea? So, hopefully, from what you have learnt so far, you have realised that it's a sexually transmitted infection. So, to prevent the infection from spreading, either people can abstain from having anal, oral, or vaginal sex, or to use some barrier type of contraception like a condom. Okay, guys, so the next disease that you need to know for your GCSE science exam is the bacterial disease of Salmonella. Salmonella, again, is something that you've probably heard about before because it is the bacterial infection that causes food poisoning. When you catch this, the symptoms that you see of food poisoning are abdominal cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. How you catch Salmonella is usually where food has been very poorly prepared. So it could be for many reasons. You could have undercooked poultry, meat, eggs, or you could have things like rice that hasn't been reheated properly. And also where there has been chopping boards that have been used where they've been used to prepare raw meat on, and then the same chopping board is used to prepare something like salad on that doesn't need cooking. It's going to be ate straight away. So it's places like that that's going to cause a Salmonella outbreak and an infection. So knowing what you know about Salmonella, I would like you to write me down some ideas on how we could prevent Salmonella from becoming a problem. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Off you go. Okay, guys, so hopefully some ideas that you have written down is to keep kitchen surfaces and areas clean and use things like Dettol spray to actually make sure that it gets rid of all the viruses or bacteria that is on the chopping boards or surfaces. Cook meat and eggs properly. Make sure that all food is reheated to a high enough temperature. And just something to bear in mind. Obviously, it says that we can catch salmonella from eating undercooked foods such as eggs. All eggs in this country that you buy from the supermarket that have a lion stamp on them have been actually screened for salmonella, so they do not contain salmonella. However, if you go down to a local farm, and sometimes when you're driving around, you can go past a farm and it'll say you can get 8 eggs for £1 or whatever. If you're actually just buying them from a farmer and they haven't been screened, there is no guarantee that those eggs will not contain salmonella. So as long as you've got them from a supermarket and they have the lion stamp on them, they are actually free from salmonella. And all poultry in the UK, so all chicken and turkey, are vaccinated against salmonella. However, if you go to a restaurant, you do not know if the meat that they have sourced, so the chicken or the turkey that they have sourced, has come from the UK. So it might have been that they've imported it from in Europe, where actually the food regulations may be very different. So wherever you eat or wherever you get food from, just check where the meat has come from. And usually when you go to the supermarket, it will tell you on the packaging where it has actually come from. So the next disease that you need to know for your GCSE science exam is the protist disease of malaria. Malaria is something, again, that you have probably heard of many times before. It is found in areas of the world where we have higher temperatures, in Africa, Asia, South and Central America, but it's not something that we see here in the UK. So mosquitoes, what they do is they suck the blood containing the protists from an infected person, and then they pass this protist to other people that they suck blood from. So the mosquitoes do not become ill themselves, so they are called vectors because they just spread the disease. And the symptoms of malaria include a fever, sweats and chills, headaches, vomiting and diarrhea. And of the 200 million people each year that are affected with malaria, up to half of the people die from this disease. So I've got a question for you then. So how is malaria spread? So I'm going to give you a minute to write down your answers on how malaria is spread. Off you go. Okay guys, so hopefully you've got written down that malaria is spread by the insect of a mosquito, and they suck the blood that contains the protist from an infected person, and then they pass this to other people they suck blood from. So the next question I have for you is, how could malaria be prevented? If you're struggling for some ideas, have a look at the picture on the right hand side. I'm going to give you a minute and a half just to write down some ideas on how you think malaria can be prevented. Off you go. So guys, hopefully you've got written down some ideas of how malaria can be prevented. These are some of the ways that it actually can be prevented. So you can wear insect repellent to stop the mosquitoes from biting you, sleep under a mosquito net to prevent the mosquitoes from biting you, and take anti-malarial drugs, and these help to treat the symptoms and stop the infection from actually happening. So the last disease that you need to know for your GCSE science exam is the fungal disease of the rose black spot. So rose black spot is a fungal infection which infects rose bushes, and if you look at the diagram on the right hand side of the page, you can see that it infects the leaves and causes black or purple spots to occur on the leaves, and the rest of the leaves then often turn yellow and can drop off the plant. Because obviously there's massive black patches over the leaves or purple patches, this reduces the plant's ability to be able to photosynthesize, and then obviously it reduces the growth of the plant. It can be transmitted by the air or by water, as well as through direct contact by gardeners. So if they go from one plant to the next, they can transfer that fungal infection. And it is treatable using fungicides and by removing and destroying any infected leaves. So I've got a question for you. Why can a plant infected with rose black spot no longer photosynthesize? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to write down your answer. Off you go. So hopefully you have written down that the rose black spot can no longer photosynthesize because now it has black spots on the leaves, which prevents the plant from photosynthesizing. Okay, so that's the end of today's lesson, guys. The last thing that I would like you to do today is to make a copy of these summary notes. I'm going to give you 5 minutes after I've read them to you to copy them down. So the summary of today's lesson is that pathogens are microorganisms which cause disease. Virus, fungi, bacteria and protists are examples of pathogens. Bacteria produce toxins which cause tissue damage. Viruses replicate inside cells, burst out and cause cell damage. TMV, measles and HIV are examples of viral diseases. Gonorrhea and Salmonella are examples of bacterial diseases. Rose black spot is an example of a fungal disease, and malaria is an example of a protist disease. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to write down these summary notes. If you need any more time after you have had the 5 minutes, then please pause the video in order to allow you to complete the notes. Thank you.